Okay, I'll give it just 1 minute to allow final people to join us before we'll start the webinar. So good morning in the US, good afternoon in Europe. My name's Chris Teal. I'm Senior Vice President Market Access based in London for Ipsos Mori. And I'm joined by my colleague Jason Boller, who's Senior Vice President Market Access based in Chicago. Welcome to our webinar, The Future of Pharmaceutical Pricing, Affordability, Evidence and Value Attribution. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the contribution to this webinar of many of our colleagues, both the market access team in the EU led by Richard Tolley, the team based in the US led by Jason Boller, and the team based in Singapore led by Adrian Grass. Also acknowledge the contribution of our digital and connected health centers of expertise in Ipsos, our multi-source data strategies, and our syndicated real-world evidence services. And as we all know, healthcare is evolving rapidly, and as recently as last December, ISPOR published its top 10 trends, which I'm showing you on the left-hand side of the slide now. In parallel with this, Ipsos has identified a series of game changers around healthcare. The science and technologies evolution, which has been, I suppose, accelerated with the COVID-19 pandemic, the move towards digital and connected health, holistic assessment of healthcare, multi-source data, and many other things. And most of these are summarized in our syndicated product, Digital Doctor, which we launched a few weeks ago. However, approaches to pharmaceutical pricing are certainly evolving less rapidly. And as you'll be aware, the traditional three are cost plus pricing, where the pricing is based on the cost of manufacturing the product plus a specified margin, which is only really adopted in a very few areas of the world. Competitor pricing, where pricing is based on how competitors price their product, and you price yourself at either a discount or a premium, depending on your relative clinical effectiveness and basically how you stack up against your competition. And with a trend towards value-based pricing, where pricing is based on the perceived value to the customer. However, we in Ipsos believe that the approach to pricing needs to be re-engineered to address those four biggest game changers that Ipsos has identified. And I'll rapidly repeat those. First of all, there is the science and technology, and that is clearly the single biggest disruptor that we're seeing in healthcare landscape as we go forward. There's a shift in focus from the assessment of a drug, a diagnostic or a device in isolation to a much more holistic assessment of the value of healthcare, whether it's including disease prevention and disease management. We're seeing a shift towards connected health, the linking of patient level, often real world and often real-time data together with precision medicine, biomarkers, genomics, and the world of personalized healthcare. And we're seeing multi-source data, and regulatory and health technology assessments are increasingly embracing data and evidence beyond traditional randomized controlled trials. So our hypothesis is that pricing negotiation going forward will increasingly need to consider three things: affordability, evidence availability, and something we'll come on to in greater detail later in this webinar, value attribution. And I think affordability has really two components. It's where you have to link your pricing to ability to pay, and where you have to link your pricing to the timing of the payment, because we're increasingly seeing areas of high price density where we have a high single upfront payment with long-term outcomes and certainty, as we're seeing currently with cell and gene therapies. Evidence availability is an interesting one because it splits up into two buckets. You're having to negotiate your price based on very little data versus your price based on an abundance of data. Little data may be single-arm open label studies being the basis for your license here. tumor agnostic licensure in oncology, leading to actually having to negotiate and set prices in indications where there is actually no clinical data. And value attribution, where you're actually looking at where the value comes from. The issue of where you're pricing a combination of products, typically in oncology, or stacks of products where you have probably even more than two, maybe three products. And pricing based on the codependent value that's spread across multiple manufacturers and multiple technologies, which we're seeing with the fusing of precision medicine, genomics, and digital health, the apps, the wearables, the machine learning, the artificial intelligence. So we'll start with affordability. Now, affordability is a global problem with significant consequences for patients. We in Ipsos undertook a global health service monitor in December of last year. And you see in this slide on the left, you see there are lots of countries where affordability of good healthcare is very, very difficult. South Africa's, Peru's, LATAM markets, and even some Eastern European markets. And at the bottom, you see countries like Sweden, South Korea, Great Britain, Netherlands, and Canada, where there is a perception that healthcare is more affordable. But of course, all of this has affordability has significant consequences for patients, as you see on the right-hand side of my slide, based on claims data in 2019 in the US, which shows the rate at which patients who start a new therapy abandon prescriptions at pharmacies with increasing frequency as prescription costs rise. So I saw that personally also in work that I did in the past in non-small cell lung cancer, where I think up to 40% of patients prescribed oral TKIs were not actually cashing in their scripts at the pharmacy in an end of life condition. The other thing I think we need to look at is that and recognize is that pricing needs to be linked to ability to pay. And there are quite a few solutions that are currently being developed by the pharma industry, where brands that are specific to emerging markets where incomes are much lower and affordability is much more of a challenge. The use of data as a currency, where price is traded for access to real world data. Pharma companies are supporting infrastructure, they're training HCPs, they're facilitating clinics for screening and diagnosis. They are donating a free drug to eligible patients, and they're forwarding affordability programs and loyalty schemes. All of these, I think, require two particular skills: the skill of coordination and the skill of collaboration, the ability to work with government officials, with non-government organizations, and programs that are actually exquisitely tailored to the country's health system to deliver medicines that will be locally affordable for patients. And it's not uncommon for market research and access agencies such as Ipsos to work with international development space. And we've recently been working with Population Services International, a non-governmental organization under funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to look at some of the issues within HIV. And as I mentioned earlier, certain situations require pricing to be linked to the timing of payment. So the actual funding system is arguably not fit for purpose for the future. And let's take, for example, gene therapy, which presents specific challenges. Clearly, cost is the biggest concern. These costs of these therapies, as we know from recent cases, can be extremely expensive, in the $400,000 to even $1 to $2 million range. And further challenge is the timing of this cost. The fact that all or most of the costs are often upfront and not borne over time, as you get with chronic treatments. There is uncertainty around long-term benefit. Often these therapies, like the gene therapies, have been on an expedited regulatory pathway, and they may hence yield shorter-term data on efficacy that is needed to prove the long-term benefits of the therapy. And this can cause significant challenges relating to funding something up front for when there's great uncertainty in the longer term. There's also the challenge payers are pointing out too. How you define value. And many payers are often resistant to the idea of pricing and reimbursement being tied to measurements which are novel compared to the one which they like, which is the offset of medical cost. But as you've seen in recent developments with in gene therapies, a lot of these problems appear to be solved, but in actual fact they haven't, because there are certain future concerns that the current gene therapies tend to be niche areas, rare diseases, with a significant quality of life value. But if you look at the pipelines in gene therapies that cure mainstream chronic diseases, involving large populations, they would face significant pricing challenges going forward, which is one to think about as we go forward. And also, I think one of the things we need to consider is that funding flows may need to be changed to relieve financial pressures. A gene therapy creates significant administrative and financial pressure on providers. Yeah, often there are needs to change the billing and coding systems. And one also needs to look at the supply chain. Payers often encounter additional financial pressures in the form of markups from hospitals or specialized treatment centers. And if they're being charged at a percentage of the payment, and the payment is $1 million, then you have a big problem. So, one of the options is for payers to purchase the gene therapies directly from the manufacturer and pay the manufacturer directly to avoid markup. Traditional financial mechanisms are often not adequate, and alternative payment models are often being considered, some of which from different industries, from the financial services sector, for example. And you see here some of the approaches that we're seeing and are being experimented with. But the key message is that all of those funding mechanisms have pros and cons. All of them are situation dependent. All require close collaboration between the manufacturer and the payer. Most of them require ongoing real-world data capture, and some may involve the involvement of an intermediary or a broker. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Jason in the US to give a particular spin from a US perspective on the issue of affordability. Over to you, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And hello, everyone. So in the US, the spotlight has been on affordability and drug pricing and drug spend for the last several years. Lots of discussion around on the patient side, looking at their affordability in terms of high deductible health plans, co-insurance rates, Part D benefit designs, looking at copay accumulators and maximizers. On the government side, the numerous policy proposals the last several years aimed at reducing drug spend, including looking at rebates, drug importation, international reference pricing, allowing Medicare to negotiate. On the employer side, looking at self-funded employers, lots of interest on their end around reducing drug spend and prices, leading to the formation of employer coalitions to improve their bargaining power, to help them spread risk, but also to advance their policy agenda. I don't know if you can read the screen here, but really it's just an excerpt from the Employers RX, looking at their agenda for this year, which gets into things like advocating to allow Medicare to negotiate the price for certain drugs, or to implement caps on, or price inflation caps, and then eliminating the buy and bill incentive. I'd say in general, again, this has been a hot topic for years, and the question now is, why now? Why today? Like, really, what's changing that this is really in the spotlight and where can this go? And recently, I was speaking with a client, and she asked a very provocative question around, are we reaching a point in the U.S. Based on the innovation we're seeing where the U.S. model may break? We're really focused on the self-funded employer model in commercial markets. That's, you look at a lot of these self-funded employers with membership or employees less than 5,000, their ability to pay for some of these therapies is a dimension that can really impact their budget. So the question is, how sustainable is this as more and more therapies like this come to market, where it may not be any one individual drug or therapy or TA that causes the tipping point, but just at a macro level, the culmination of all these therapies impacting the self-funded employer's ability to really pay for this innovation. I think that begs a question of, really, where is this going in the next several years, and what does it mean to you as you're building your access strategies? And really, just a couple pages here. Go ahead, Chris, the next page. It's really just some thoughts on how could this can evolve from just looking at just right now only the high cost oncology, rare disease, cell and gene therapies, where the top one looks at, again, this idea that for employers of sharing risk, entering into coalitions to share risk, purchasing stop loss insurance. What that means for manufacturers is as they do that, it's engaging new stakeholders in terms of value proposition and VBC discussions, having to engage stop loss carriers or at the employer coalition level to influence access decision making. In the event that Medicare is allowed to negotiate drug prices for certain therapies, that is a very different dynamic. And for Medicare, they will likely want tools at their disposal to really help inform their pricing calculation decisions. So it wouldn't be unexpected for them to look at international international benchmarks or ICER-like assessments to help them make decisions or inform what the price should be if they're negotiating. And really the last two just get into this idea of pay over time, demand for VBCs for therapies where the high cost up front, but uncertain outcomes. And really it's ensuring that your value prop and your pricing reflects that value of the therapy, the value over time, so that value aligns with the revenue recognition, but also from an outcome standpoint, ensuring that the pricing reflects different outcome scenarios. Is it a binary situation where there's a very clear outcome of it works or it doesn't, or are the outcomes more like a scale where there is value in a partial response or value when even like a second therapy or second course is needed. If we go to the next page, and more generally speaking, just a few other things to look at. One around indication-based pricing and formularies. That's been going on for years now. But there is recognition that at an indication level, two things. One, that the market price for an indication can just be very different between two different diseases with the same product, but also that the drug's value or an asset's value can be very different, or different patient responses and different indications which reflect that value. So I do think we'll get to this point of seeing this more indication level contracting and pricing. The integration between the pharmacy and medical is interesting. I think we're seeing that accelerate, which represents an opportunity, but also something that may be a potential challenge. The opportunity being that with this integration comes the opportunity to really articulate a more holistic value prop for the therapy, combining the pharmacy and the medical. The challenge is looking at, in this world where it's integrated, thinking about your access strategy and having to navigate, potentially being stepped through therapies on another benefit or into medical benefits contracting discussions. The third one gets into the idea of new specialty tiers to help the patient. So that'll drive additional competition within these classes where now you're competing for that preferred specialty tier, where if you're on the high tier, that patient may face that 33% co-insurance, but now if you get the preferred tier, we don't know what that rate would be, but it could be a level that will really change behavior around and ensuring adoption and utilization of that preferred specialty, just reduce the patient out of pocket, but also drive the competitive dynamics. And then lastly, inflation caps. Really, I think that this really this becomes the norm. It just impacts the ability to use pricing as a lever to manage growth for the brand. So as a quick run through on the U.S. side of affordability, I think we could spend a lot of time talking about any one of these topics, but for now, it's a high-level overview. So, Chris, back to you.
Thanks, Jason. We'll move on now from affordability to evidence. And pricing is clearly driven by evidence availability and acceptability. And I think we're seeing two situations are increasingly occurring. One is which the trend towards having to undertake price negotiations based on very little data, as we might see through the absence of randomized controlled trials, data licensed here on the basis of open label single arm studies, or even what we're seeing most recently in oncology, potentially tumor agnostic licensure leading to pricing and indications, whereas actually there is no data, no clinical data. And on the other side, we're seeing an abundance of data and increasing acceptability of multi-source data, including real-world evidence. So very quickly, on the left-hand side of the slide where you've got a lack of data, then non-comparative data plus modeling is acceptable in health technology assessment and price negotiations where in circumstances where randomized controlled trials are not appropriate, as we might see where randomized controlled trials are not ethical, feasible, or practical. And there's already guidance from the FDA and EMA about the situations in which uncontrolled studies are acceptable. Basically they are acceptable where a change is clearly attributable to the therapy, a placebo response is minimal, prognosis is bleak, and there is no acceptable control arm. And in addition, it's also very important that the endpoint must be hard and objective and not subjective. And indeed, the non-comparative studies may provide the best available evidence. But what's most interesting here, I think, is the need quite often to have modeling in parallel with the non-comparative data. So comparison of single-arm trial with an artificial comparator arm built out of real-world data based on modeling has been used in regulatory submissions within both the FDA and EMA, and also in various health technology assessments. And moving on now to talk about where you have a lot of data, and the positive thing here is that health technology assessments and pricing negotiations are increasingly embracing data and evidence beyond traditional randomized controlled trials. And I've taken the information on the left-hand side on the types of data, which I won't go through, from a NICE consultation in the UK about 1.5 years ago. And the result of that consultation being that data, providing that it is of a sufficient methodological robustness and standard, is acceptable from all of those sources on the left. But I just take home on this slide, demonstrating value in pricing negotiations using multi-source data does need forethought and planning. You should always consider data to be an investment, and you should evaluate it as such. And when we're talking with our clients, we always remind them that the cost of not having data may far, far exceed the cost of generating it or accessing it. The other thing that we're seeing is that increasingly a shift towards strategic partnerships between manufacturers and data providers. They're becoming increasingly necessary to source data for HTA and price assessment. And I'll just pick one example out of here. The acquisition of Flatiron by Roche a couple of years ago granted them access to 2.2 million active patient records, which could be used for helping build their pricing their value proposition and supporting their pricing strategy. The other thing is we talk a lot about real world data, but we rarely ask ourselves, and it's critically important, increasingly important in pricing. But a one-size-fits-all approach does not apply to the selection of real-world data sources. And it's very important that the selection process for the data should be customized to the research question, the target audience, and the stage you're at in your product development. And we basically, with Ipsos, have 3 basic questions relating to data availability, data relevance, and data reliability. And you know, the payers in my negotiation experience always come down to discuss the representative of data, the robustness of the data, and the reliability of the data. And when you come to use real-world evidence within your HTA and pricing negotiations, it's not even necessary that your product is actually on the market, because you can establish a baseline pre-launch around what is the standard of care, what is the financial impact of the disease, what is the burden of illness on both the healthcare system, but also on the patient, and what are the unmet needs well before launch to establish your baseline, and then post-launch leverage data on usage, claims, clinical effectiveness, safety, budget impact, and cost effectiveness. And the good news is that HTA, health technology assessment organizations, are increasingly accepting a broader range of data sources. I won't go this, but there have been announcements in the last year from both England, NICE, France, the Higher Authority for Health, and in Germany, the IQWiG and the Common Federal Committee, the Gemeinsamesbundes Ausschuss, relating to increased acceptability of data, breadth of data. And we've had similar announcements by CADTH in Canada, ICER in the US, PBAC in Australia, HERA in South Korea, and UNET-HATA in Europe. So that's really the section on evidence, the 2 extremes of there isn't much or there's a lot. We're now moving on to value attribution, or what is it and why is it important, and why will it be increasingly important in pricing in the future. And I'm going to consider two situations where this may be the case, both of which are actually relevant today. One is the pricing of combination therapies and stacks of drugs, which you see typically in oncology. And the other one is price negotiation that is spread across multiple manufacturers and multiple technologies, such as you're seeing with the challenges of precision medicine, biomarkers, diagnostics, genomics, digital health, apps, wearables, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And the simple one of stacks is that, you know, in many diseases, you use several medicines in combination, using complementary mechanisms of action or in close sequence. And these deliver better outcomes for patients. And in the case of oncology, can often deliver longer treatment durations as progression-free survival and overall survival are extended. And we see that within our Ipsos oncology therapy monitors that we use a lot in this area. Also, there's some really interesting insights that came from a recent conference presented by the Office of Health Economics in the UK, where they stated that HTA often concludes that the additional benefits from adding a new medicine to a currently reimbursed medicine does not necessarily represent value for money to the healthcare system, particularly when if you're using cost per quality approaches to assess value, because a clinically effective medicine may even be found to be non-cost effective at zero price when used as part of a treatment regimen that increases treatment duration. And you know, we have been working within Ipsos for several years in this area, and I'm just extracting here from a publication we gave at HISPOR in Glasgow three and a half years ago now, and that in order to be successful in this area, you need the alignment of 4 factors. You have to have payers and manufacturers' willingness to change and adapt. You have to have open access data infrastructure. You have to have transparent and methodologically robust analytics. And you need a systematic approach to defining relative value that is perceived by all stakeholders as being unbiased and comprehensive. Now, this is a pricing challenge where value attribution brings all sorts of contractual and legal issues to market, because you have a multi-product regimen that may have multiple owners, and you are prohibited by competition law to negotiate with each other on the prices of the individual constituent elements that comprise the regimen. And so you cannot come with a proposal for an agreed total treatment costs. Whereas if you only have one owner, where all constituents are owned by a single company, then of course that company will be able to present a total cost of regimen that is satisfactory to the payer and price the constituent medicines accordingly, offering discounts as necessary. In actual fact, the payers are becoming very wise to this challenge. And yeah, I was certainly involved recently in a payer negotiation where they were negotiating, I think it was in multiple myeloma, their price, and the negotiators brought in the manufacturer of the other parts of the combination regimen to try and negotiate their price downwards, given there would be increased utilization of both products in that marketplace. So the fundamental questions here are: how should the payers decide? How should value and revenues be allocated between companies? And what are the implications for the other indications of the constituent medicines? And basically, there are 4 problems that need to be solved. And again, I'd like to reference the Office of Health Economics here. There's the incentive problem, the value attribution problem. How do you actually attribute the value in a combination to the constituent medicines in the regime? There's a competition law problem. And probably the most important of these at the end is the implementation problem, because if you could solve the previous problems 1 to 3, they will still need to be implemented within a given pricing and reimbursement system, its laws and policies. And that requires, as Jason mentioned, things like some sort of indication-based pricing, multi-use pricing, ring fencing, and more pragmatic solutions such as weighted average prices that are being adopted. Certainly we're seeing these issues being actively addressed at the moment in countries as far apart as France and Australia. And I think as we go forward, we'll see this more and more of an issue. And indeed, it becomes even more challenging when we consider the codependent value spread across multiple manufacturers and technologies. And let's consider this example. You have a manufacturer developing remote real-time monitoring, maybe having an app. In addition, you may be in the oncology space, where you actually have a diagnostic that is identifying biomarkers which will be used to inform therapeutic strategy. And then you have a couple of manufacturers. You have manufacturer one, who's producing drug 1 in this combination therapy, and manufacturer 4, who's bringing drug 2 into the combination therapy or stack. And all of this is linked together by software, algorithms, and potentially predictive analytics. Now, this actually isn't that futuristic. We've just had a situation, for example, in Germany, I believe, where in recent weeks, an app in breast cancer has been reimbursed, which obviously, because it's been reimbursed, the payers have concluded that it contributes value to the overall disease management of the patient who is being subjected to diagnoses to detect their type of breast cancer, and also is being treated by different therapeutics. So, you have a situation there where somebody has to put an attribute value to part of a sort of multifactorial, multi-manufacturer, multi-technology disease management. So what are the solutions? Well, I don't know. It's something that we will be working on going forward. Is it a DRG for a disease, which incorporates all these pieces together to give a more holistic view of cost and value and outcome? Or do you price everything separately? But if you do, how do you take this forward and price according to overall health gain, which is dependent on all the parts of the treatment process? Again, something we're increasingly working with our clients to address. Again, often most importantly, from a pragmatic perspective. In which case, I'm going to hand over now to Jason to give a view on value attribution from the US. Jason?
Okay, thanks, Chris. All right. So in this one, we want to focus on oncology. And when it comes to oncology pricing, a lot goes into that. It's very complex, but we want to focus on really 3 key considerations within oncology. The first is the importance of net cost recovery, so practice economics. The second, looking at total cost of care, and then really the third being the third-party value assessments. All this assumes that an agent or a regimen has received the NCCN endorsement that and really ensures payer coverage. Then once you get beyond that, we'll look at these levers. And the question for us is, how will the importance of each one of these shift over time? And if we go to the next page, think about oncology and value-based care. This is just an excerpt from the latest report from OCM from this year. And really, the shift findings are is that for OCM, oncology value-based care, in general, there have been some pockets of success. However, as a whole, it's really not achieving its intended objectives around improving outcomes and reducing drug spend. So you see a lot of these quotes taken directly from the reports. And knowing that with OCM, that I think we have another year of OCM before we shift to OCF in the future, the question becomes, how will that evolution, what will be the change from OCM to OCF? We go to the next page, Chris. As we think about the next iteration of OCM, how do we think that will change to address some of the shortcomings of today, and then really what will be the implication on pricing strategies? And when you look at the proposed OCF model and some of the comments where we're seeing, essentially you can summarize is that we're going to more one capitation. And today it's a lot of fee-for-service reimbursement plus the MIOs, but in the future it's more capitation. So the evaluation and monitoring, the drug admin, overall more capitation. There's a question around how far can the capitation go? Will that include lab diagnostics? Will that include the drug add-on payments? That's a big question mark. Also, the patient population is expanding. Today it's really starts those patients receiving chemo. That starts an event. In the future, it's really broadening out to include those patients plus those on hormone therapy or those under surveillance. So now we have more capitation, larger patient populations, And then for the cost of care, total cost of care benchmarks that drive the performance-based payments, having novel therapy adjustments at a cancer type level, and also looking at total cost of care from a tumor type disease progression level. And really looking at, taking these all together, the question is, where's this going again? And what does it mean as you're developing a pricing strategy for an oncology agent or regimen? So go to the next page. Remember, this is just three things that we're thinking about. One is, how far will the capitation go in the future? So if we're going to award a more value-based care in oncology, more practices shifting in the community to OC and OCF type reimbursements, and it's more capitation, how far can that go? Based on that, how will that change preferences for treatment choice? Will we choose regimens that have shorter infusions, more oral or sub-Q options? And from a pricing standpoint, it's really just understanding that practice economic incentive, how that's changing, and how, from a community practice standpoint, that importance of net cost recovery versus total cost of care, that trade-off, how's that really changing? So we get to a world where the drug add-on payment is bundled into the capitation, then the buy and bill incentive is not gone, but it's an even level playing field now. So how does that impact practice economics and how you price? The next piece looks at the total cost of care benchmarks. They're expected to vary by tumor type and cancer stage. And thinking about those benchmarks, how that impacts performance-based pricing, what could happen? Looking at this, you may have models that predict that as a patient progresses, the spend is expected to decrease as they progress. Therefore, regimens are expected to get more expensive, and that could impact willingness to prescribe a FDA-approved NCCN endorsed regimen for first line. That may shift that to a later line just based off of that, that total cost of care benchmark for the earlier lines. Also, if you're looking at two regimens that have very similar combinations, you may swap out one agent. If you look at the cost of care data, one may have a shorter cost of care, where in the first year they're the more cost-effective option, or the second regimen, they become more cost-effective after 2 years. So again, if you have those two choices, how would you, as a practice where you're reimbursed under 6-month cost of care benchmarks, would you be willing to pick the regimen that has that longer care view? And how do you influence that? Really, the implication is making sure that your pricing is aligned and reflects the value of the brand and the regimen, and how that value varies across tumor types and cancer stage, and also that it reconciles with the 6-month total cost of care benchmarks. Yeah. And then on the commercial side, where we're seeing payers use clinical pathways to sometimes restrict choice. Now, if they have that data showing how cost of care varies by regimen, by tumor stage, even though something is NCCN endorsed and preferred, it's covered as FDA approval, it still may not be included in a payer pathway where it's relegated to later lines. So as a pricing strategist, this idea of looking at payers' willingness to restrict choice in their pathway, even though it's already covered and approved. But how does that behavior impact your pricing, and how much you're willing to invest to try to drive earlier line use to ensure that patients have access, especially in practices that are heavily reimbursed under OCM, and that really drives their decision making. Again, all these are very meaty topics, but happy to go to in some more detail. Yeah, that's just initial thoughts of how this topic around value attribution, bundling of oncology regimens, really where we are in the U.S. today. So for that, back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Jason. So looking ahead and trying to summarize everything that we've done in the last 35, 40 minutes, looking ahead, I think on the affordability front, there'll be an increasing need to address who pays for what and what their willingness or ability to pay is. I think when it comes to evidence availability, it's very clear we'll have more and more alternative, often unstructured data sources available that will need to be integrated. I think the focus here needs to be the integration of these multiple data sources. It's not just the data sources in isolation. And finally, on value attribution, I think we conclude there will be a shift in focus from the assessment of a drug in isolation to a more holistic assessment of the value of disease management. And this will involve multiple manufacturers and multiple technologies. So value and revenue attribution will be very, very important for price and HTA negotiation. So at that point, we'll finish, and we'll move to. I think we've got a short while left. We've probably got only about 5 minutes. Those of you that have submitted questions online, Jason and I will follow up with you outside of this this webinar. The three people who were responsible for putting this webinar together are the people you see on the screen, and we'll be very happy to follow up with you on those email addresses. But first of all, just taking 1 or 2 questions in the few remaining minutes. Jason, you touched upon this, I think, in the affordability section. You know, pricing and affordability has been discussed as a priority in the US for several years now. What would it take to trigger real change in the US?
That's a good question, Chris. You know, I like looking to my crystal ball, but yeah, I think you're right. I mean, this, like I said, this has been discussed for a number of years. It's an ongoing topic, but I think, you know, recently with the launch of these cell and gene therapies, these curative therapies with the high upfront cost, the longer term outcomes uncertainty, I think that, you know, causes a couple of challenges which could trigger real change. One is just around the affordability of being able to finance and fund that upfront piece. And I think I mentioned that, or if you're a self-funded employer with a relatively small employee base, you know, 1 or 2 of these patients on this could really break your healthcare budget. So that leads to more pooling of resources, purchasing stop loss. Again, it's the idea of, like, you know, larger member base to spread risk, which now you're going down towards, you know, trying to recreate single payer-like constructs in a commercial population. So again, like risk pool, expanding that. That plus the time dimension of that uncertainty of, if you're looking at a 5 to 7 year window where value is being realized, and given patients switching commercial plans in the US, how do you, the risk sharing helps, but then once patients are switching plans, you go to the next employer, they're willing to take on, you know, any continued payments using a time model. I think like that the cost and the time dimension really gets in this idea of, you know, one, we need to look at risk sharing, but also, you know, the idea of Medicare negotiating prices for this. And that's step one. And then could we additionally see a Medicare carve out to where they're doing the price negotiation, but also they are taking the risk of the patient. So you eliminate that idea, the risk of patients switching between plans. You know, if we go down that path, that begs the question of where does it stop? You know, is it just the cell and gene therapies, or is it just therapies over a certain price point? But that really opens the door to more universal coverage, single payer coverage of certain therapies. And perhaps it's something like this where you have enough of these therapies that, again, are high cost upfront, long-term outcomes are uncertain. Does that really reach a tipping point where, as an employer, you just can't afford to continue to pay for this, and we're going down this path?
Right. Thanks for that, Jason. Thanks for that insight. We've got a couple of others. I think we might have time just for one more question. The one that came in line, to what extent do you feel international price referencing will become more relevant in the US going forward? I think the person who issued it, they'd heard about the most favored nation model last year. And, you know, what are your views on the future? Will international reference pricing become a fact within the US or have any influence on any part of the US market? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I know it's still being, it's still being discussed. It's still, you know, kind of on the table. It's, you know, there is this desire of, you know, to reduce drug spend in the U.S. for the Medicare population, for the Part B drugs, where you see the high spend per beneficiary. You know, I can see where that will become more like a tool to really look at. Now, does that become the norm for setting prices for Part B drugs? Again, it becomes more like a political discussion, not really sure. But I do think if you get to the point where Medicare is allowed to negotiate prices, then they will need tools for these therapies that lack competitive options. And so I could see them factoring in international price indexes to really help inform their decision making. I think that'd be one of their tools. Like I mentioned, the other tool would be around ICER-like or HE-like assessments, to bring those two things here to allow them to make informed, to arm them or equip them to negotiate.
Thanks, Jason. I think we're running out of time to take any further questions. We have them. We'll follow up independently with those people that have submitted them. I think in addition, those people that have registered this webinar will be following up with you to send you a copy of the recording. And again, if you have any questions on any of the topics in this webinar or any of the issues in any of those markets, if you can email either myself, Chris Teal, Jason Boller, or Adrian Grass, we'll be delighted to follow up with you. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day, and thank you for your time in attending our webinar today. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.